While we tend to think of other parts of the country as being more susceptible to hurricanes, New England is not immune to them. With hurricane season upon us, Carrie Saldo sat down with Christopher Besse from the Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency to discuss how to prepare for and deal with these storms.
Atlantic hurricane season begins June 1st, or began June 1st, so we're in that now. But here, when we look at historically in New England, the hurricanes we've seen are typically in the August or September timeframe in terms of when the Atlantic activity really heats up and when we've seen it historically. That being said, it's been a while since we've seen any real activity here in Massachusetts, so we really use the whole summer as a reminder for people to prepare for hurricanes.
And Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency, MEMA, I'll use that because it's a lot easier, has kind of 4 steps for people while we're thinking about how to prepare for this. And right now, hurricanes really, I think MEMA is encouraging people to think that it's a statewide concern. People might look at this and think, you're in Western Massachusetts, I'm not in Boston, I don't have to worry about this. Why should this be on people's minds?
So there's really a lot of different impacts when we talk about hurricanes. You know, obviously one of the ones people at first comes to mind is the coastal impacts and the coastal flooding and the storm surge, and that's certainly a huge issue for people along the eastern coast of Massachusetts. And for those people, we have various hurricane evacuation zones, and we want them to know if they're in one of those zones, or if people, watching this vacation in that area, to know that those exist along the coastal threat. But some of the other threats that we see are the heavy rain and the strong winds. And those can really cause devastating damage far away from the coastline. So even looking back to 2011 when we saw Tropical Storm Irene, we look at the flooding and the damage that we saw in Berkshire and Franklin County in particular and up into Vermont. Was really catastrophic in areas. And those areas are obviously nowhere near the coastline. So people think about hurricanes as a coastal problem, but in a small state like Massachusetts, they can really impact the entire state.
I think Hurricane Irene, as you're driving around, you can still see impacts of that, especially in that southern Vermont area, well beyond the fact that it happened in 2011. Here we are in 2019. Are there things that MEMA learned about from Hurricane Irene that you're using as best practices now, or ways to adjust the way that people should approach hurricane season?
I think the biggest thing that we look at is really the impacts of each storm. And Irene in particular, a small change in the storm's track, 50 miles can make a drastic difference of where those impacts are. So in our case, we were very prepared for the storm, but largely focused on the coastal impacts, and then we had to adjust and shift some of our resources out west. So it wasn't something that was unfamiliar to us, but it was just that small change in a storm track last minute can change those impacts. So that's why we really are thinking now about statewide planning and preparedness from our level. When we do hurricane outreach and preparedness, we open it up to all of our local partners across the state to make sure that they're all aware of that risk. And if we do have a storm approaching, we really want people to pay attention across the state for those impacts that are specific to their area.
You mentioned a minute ago this concept of know your zone, and people, again, here listening in Western Massachusetts might think you said that those zones are targeted on the coastal area, which makes sense, but people might be vacationing on the Cape and along that ocean front. So how or where do they look to find out what zone they're in?
That's right. So a few years ago, we've launched the state's hurricane evacuation zones, and those are the areas along the coast that are most susceptible to storm surge flooding. So that is the ocean pushing inland. We have information in interactive maps on our website, mass.gov/MEMA, or the direct link is mass.gov/knowyourzone. So even though people here may not be primarily living in those areas, again, as you mentioned, they may be vacationing in those areas, they may have friends or family who are in those areas. One of the things we like to tell people, if you're outside an evacuation zone, and you know someone who's in a zone and they need to evacuate, offer your home if you can as a place for them to come and ride out the storm if you can, particularly if you're far enough inland. So even those people that may need to evacuate from those areas, there still are those other hazards that we talked about in Western Massachusetts. So there still may be flooding, or there still may be serious consequences, but that coastal storm surge threat is really just along the coastline.
Something else MEMA is encouraging is make a plan. What are the elements that should be rolled into someone's emergency plan?
So when we talk about making an emergency plan, these are really things that people can use in any type of emergency. So not just hurricanes, but whether we have a tornado, whether we have a power outage, or any other event, things that people can do ahead of time. So some of those things are about communications plans, about making sure people have the ways to contact their family. We encourage people to have phone numbers written down. In addition, this day and age, most people have them stored in their cell phone. But what if their cell phone isn't working, or they, doesn't have battery, or service isn't working, that they need those contacts? So We encourage people to have emergency contacts written down for key people in their family. We encourage people to think about if they did have to evacuate, and that might be with some notice or it may be on short notice. Where would they go? What would they take with them? How would they get there? And also just making sure that people have plans if they need to stay in their home, what we call shelter in place, which again may happen in a hurricane, that people are kind of hunkering down, or a winter storm, that people have all the supplies and the things that they need to be safe in their home.
And is this a plan that should be written down and discussed amongst the family members and maybe even a business if you work there?
So it doesn't have to be written down. Certainly the more planning and thought that's put into it, the better the plan will be. The most important thing is that people have done something and have talked through it with their family. So it can be sitting around over dinner one night talking about a what if something happens. And as long as everyone in the family knows that plan, then that doesn't have to be written down. For certain,
I'm a planner, so I like to have a
right,
document.
and certainly we are too, and it's always a good thing. But when I think that sometimes can scare people in thinking about it has to be this big formal thing, and it really doesn't. It can be a simple conversation and thoughts about what you would do. But for certain organizations, businesses, obviously public safety agencies, they do different planning, and that typically is more written down. Business continuity planning for businesses about what if I can't get to my business? How do I keep, can I work remotely? What about my facility? What are my essential functions to keep business going on? Because businesses, just like homeowners, can be impacted by disasters as well. So making sure that they're prepared from an insurance perspective, and their employees know what to do in an emergency as well.
Make a kit. What should be in an emergency kit?
So an emergency kit, again, it sounds like a big thing, but it's really just the extra things people need around their home to be self-sufficient. We like to say 3 to 5 days. Again, it could be a winter storm that people can't get out of their house. It could be a devastating natural disaster, a tornado, a hurricane, where maybe there's debris on the roads and people can't get to the store, or the stores are closed, or the power is out. We just want to make sure people have what they need to be self-sufficient. So for most people, obviously, they've got some extra food in their home, but making sure people have at least 3 days of bottled water, 1 gallon per person per day. And really customizing the supplies for what people need for their own family. So if people use medicine, to try to have an extra few days worth of medicine if they can. If they have medical equipment, they've got extra batteries or ways to use that medical equipment in a power outage. If people have pets, making sure they have all the things they would need for their pets in an emergency: food, water, tags, carrier, etc., in case they do need to leave their home, that they've got what they need for them as well.
So kind of just doing a sweep of the home and saying, if I couldn't get out for a couple of days,
that's right,
how could I shelter in place?
Yeah, what would I need to be self-sufficient? How could I hunker down? And the more people are able to do that and be resilient and self-sufficient, the less of a demand on government for food and water and things like that in an emergency. So while we're making plans, we encourage people at home to make plans as well.
Something else you talked about is cell phone service, and maybe if the cell service went down, you didn't have access to that. But I know MEMA also encourages people to stay informed. So how do you balance those two?
Yeah, there's no one way that's always going to work in any situation. So the power may be out, but cell phones may be still working, or cell phones may be not working and the power may be on. So we really encourage people to not only that emergency contact plan that we talked about before, but ways to get information from officials. So most communities in Massachusetts have some type of reverse 911 system. So we encourage people to sign up for that. Many times you can put a landline number and a cell phone number or an email. Every city or town's a little bit different on that sign-up process, but usually online, or people can call the business number of their local officials to sign up for that. We have a smartphone app, Massachusetts Alerts, but again, that's only working when cell phones are working. But for the most part, cell phones at least have some coverage. We also encourage, if there's congestion that people can't get through making a phone call, perhaps they can text if they're not already doing that. That may be easier to get through in a time when there's congestion on the phone network.
And finally, New England's a small area, and people tend to maybe not even visit the Cape, but visit other coastal communities, beach communities in New England. Is there a place that MEMA points those folks to who might have to think about emergency planning if they're on vacation somewhere else?
So the good thing when we think about hurricanes anyways is usually there's some advance notice of the storm coming. We have other types of emergencies that are more no-notice events. But for hurricanes anyways, we usually have some notice, we plan that it's coming, we see it coming, it's on the news, we're putting out information to our partners, local public safety officials are talking about it. So for people that are in a vacationing mode from a hurricane perspective, really just want them to make sure they're being aware of the potential weather threats. If there's a storm coming, people may decide, depending on where they are in their situation, they may decide to ride out the storm if they're in a safe place in that location, or they may decide to pick up and go home, back to their home if that's a better situation. But cities and towns also have various sheltering plans across the state where if people don't have another place to go, they can open up emergency shelters for people.